There is a pattern in 500 years of monetary history that has quietly consumed three empires: Spain's silver, Britain's pound, the Soviet transferable ruble. It began in the 16th century, carried by galleons unloading silver into Seville in 1590. It resurfaced in 1914 when the British pound anchored most of the world's reserves. And it completed a cycle in 1991 when the ruble system collapsed with the USSR. The names changed, the flags on the notes changed, but the cycle did not. Expansion, overreach, strain, and break. And now, in 2025, the US dollar is sliding down that same trajectory with the same slope, the same overconfidence, the same illusion of immunity. On the surface, the three stories look unrelated. Spain intoxicated by silver, Britain intoxicated by empire, the Soviets by military reach. But if you place them on a single timeline, the blind spots align with unnerving precision. In the 1500s, prices in Spain and Western Europe rose 3 to 4. In the early 1900s, sterling dominated global reserves. By the early 1990s, the Soviet ruble had become scrap paper within a few hundred days. Behind every episode is a quiet principle. Once a currency becomes the backbone of the system, it is used past the point of safety and the system eventually refuses to carry the weight. The part no one likes to say out loud is this: the greater the privilege, the quieter the erosion. Every empire built a comforting myth for itself. Spain believed no one could match its silver, so default was impossible. Britain believed London wrote the rules, so sterling was irreplaceable. The Soviets believed a closed system could define value forever. In 2025, the US repeats the same myth with updated vocabulary. The dollar is the safe haven. You can't default on debt issued in your own currency. The words shift, but the structure is identical, familiar enough to feel like déjà vu. Collapse of a reserve currency never begins with panic. It begins with silence. Beneath normal headlines, something subtle shifts. Spain's treasure fleet slowed while war invoices grew. Britain's wartime debts ballooned long before the 1949 devaluation. The USSR carried 15 to 20% of its output in military spending while store shelves thinned out. From the outside, these systems still looked orderly, still looked composed. That is always the trick. Collapse looks stable until it doesn't. The first stage is always numerical quiet. Before sterling was cut 30% in 1949, Britain's public debt had already surpassed 200% of GDP hidden in treasury papers, not front-page news. Before the ruble zone disintegrated in 1991, the Soviet economy had endured nearly 20 years of stagnation, shrinking industrial growth, deteriorating productivity, rising military burdens. Before Spain defaulted, it had already pledged future silver shipments against present-day wars. Assuming tomorrow would always resemble yesterday. These cycles always begin with numbers the public ignores or is never shown. If you strip away the drama of imperial narratives, the arc becomes disturbingly simple. First comes spending beyond productive capacity, war, expansion, military rivalry. Then comes quiet dilution. Spain lowered the silver content in its coins. Britain held the exchange rate until it snapped. The Soviets froze prices while black markets revealed the truth. Next comes the debt spiral. New borrowing to patch old holes, the currency's prestige used as collateral for time. And finally comes the slow rot, productivity falling behind, society dividing over distribution. Trust becoming the last remaining pillar, and the first to crack. Spain is the clearest early example of a power intoxicated by its own reserve currency. After Isidore, silver from Potosi and Mexico turned the kingdom into Europe's clearinghouse. Across the 1500s, prices in Spain and much of Europe rose 200 to 300%, a lifetime of inflation compressed into a single century. The crown tolerated it, even welcomed it. Inflation was framed not as decay but as the cost of destiny. As long as silver arrived, the illusion held. But no amount of metal could plug an empire's appetite for expansion. Through the 1500s, Spain defaulted repeatedly. 1557, 1575, 1596. Roughly every 2 decades, the Treasury admitted it could no longer pay its creditors. Each reset bought time, not stability. Each renegotiation added one more hairline fracture in the foundation of trust. What the monarchy called restructuring, history now calls a countdown. Inside the country, the erosion was more intimate. The blanca, Spain's everyday coin, lost more than half its silver content over time. The stamp stayed the same, the number stayed the same, only the substance changed. People still used it for wages, taxes, bread, but the silent message was unmistakable: your money no longer represents what it used to. No king ever declared a blunt devaluation. The mints simply altered the recipe. Markets did the rest. Abroad, traders adapted even faster. When Spanish silver was pure, everyone accepted it. When inflation surged and defaults echoed across Europe, merchants shifted their trust toward Amsterdam and later London. They still took silver, but increasingly preferred gold, or Dutch bills, or anything less dependent on the health of a single crown. That was the true turning point, when the world began treating Spanish silver not as destiny, but as risk. Monetary decline rarely announces itself. It shows up first as preference. Spain did not collapse the day its reserve status weakened. It still had armies, colonies, rituals. But by the 1700s, its financial leverage had reversed polarity. Each new coin purchased less power. Each new tax filled fewer holes. By then, Spain had exhausted the line of credit history extends to ascending empires. The question was no longer how strong is Spanish silver, but who replaces it. If Spain was the raw prototype, Britain was the refined version of the same script. In 1914, just before World War I, sterling was the spine of the gold standard. Contracts, trade routes, reserves all routed through London. At its peak, the pound occupied the position the dollar would later take, the default denomination of global confidence. Empire gave Britain the map. Finance gave it the hinge of the world. But the same map that empowered it also hollowed it. World War I was the first crack. World War II was the break. By 1945, Britain's debt exceeded 200% of GDP, an empire victorious on paper, but bankrupt beneath the celebration. London preserved its flag, but mortgaged its currency. Every fiscal decision in the post-war years carried the weight of wartime borrowing. The public felt austerity. The pound felt exhaustion. Then came 1949, the quiet confession. Overnight, the pound was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80, a cut of nearly 30%. For households, it was a number. For foreign holders, it was an admission. The empire had lived beyond its monetary means. You can trace the inflection on a chart, but its real impact was psychological. A reserve currency had acknowledged its own overextension. No empire recovers from that acknowledgement. The rest of the century was the paperwork of a fate already sealed. Crises in the 1960s and 1970s, inflation above 20%, reserve depletion, and IMF bailout. And behind it all, a quiet transition already codified at Bretton Woods. The reserve anchor had shifted from sterling to the US dollar. Over the decades, sterling's share of global reserves fell from roughly 80% to a negligible sliver. On banknotes, the pound survived. In the memory of the system, it did not. 300 years separate Spain from Britain, but the sequence is identical. A privileged currency is stretched to fund strategy, war, welfare. Dilution smooths the cracks. Debt extends the illusion, productivity falls behind. The world quietly reallocates its trust. And by the time the empire realizes it, the scaffolding holding up its currency has already been moved elsewhere. In 2025, America views these cases as distant documentaries. But overlay the debt curves, the inflation shocks, the military costs, the reserve share trajectories, and a familiar silhouette emerges. A rise, a plateau, a gentle bend downward. Somewhere along that bend, the United States entered the same phase Spain and Britain once crossed. Not the collapse, the prelude. The vector is set. This is not prophecy. This is the file. There is a moment in every empire's story when the numbers stop making sense. Yet the system insists nothing is wrong. The Soviet Union reached that moment long before anyone acknowledged it. By the early 1970s, its military machine consumed between 15 and 20% of national output, an invisible weight pressing against a slowing economy. Factories still lit their furnaces, ministries still printed glowing reports. But the pulse of productivity was already fading. A great power can hide weakness from the world, but it cannot hide weakness from its own accounts. In the Soviet cities, the silence was louder than any crisis. Store shelves thinned slowly, then predictably. Growth targets were declared, then missed. then quietly rewritten. People learned to measure the value of the ruble not by the numbers printed on it, but by how many hours they had to wait in line to trade it for bread or shoes. A currency becomes hollow long before it collapses. The collapse is only the moment the hollowness becomes undeniable. The transferable ruble, the USSR's internal reserve currency, followed the same script as Spain as silver and Britain as sterling, only inside a closed room. On paper, it was anchored to gold. In practice, it was anchored to obligation. The Comecon states settled their trade in a unit no one outside the bloc valued, a currency held together more by fear of deviation than by economic logic. Everyone pretended it worked because the alternative was admitting it didn't. Pretending is always the last phase before unraveling. When January 1, 1991 arrived and the transferable ruble system was shut off, the end looked sudden. It wasn't. The system had been dying for years through stagnation. Through shortages, through a widening gap between official truth and lived reality. Currency collapses do not begin with collapse. They begin with disbelief that collapse is possible. The Soviet Union had been living inside that disbelief for a decade before the final switch was flipped. What makes these cases truly converge is not their aesthetics but their mechanics. Spain diluted its coins when silver lost its shine. Britain devalued when sterling could no longer carry the empire's debts. The Soviets suppressed prices instead of admitting the ruble's erosion. Three different vocabularies, one identical function, protect the illusion that the currency remained whole. Once the illusion becomes more important than the currency itself, the cycle is already in motion. By the time the Soviet collapse arrived, the pattern was complete. Military overextension had drained capacity. Monetary distortion had severed trust. Debt, formal or hidden, had outrun the system's ability to service it. Productivity had stalled, and society had learned to navigate around its own currency. What happened in the final 900 days was not a downfall. It was gravity reclaiming what bureaucratic theater had held in place. When you turn from that archive to the United States in 2025, the sense of déjà vu is uncomfortable. Not because the structures are identical, they are not, but because the gradients rhyme. A nation with global commitments feels the weight of sustaining them. A currency tasked with supporting everything becomes the tool of last resort. A public accustomed to stability begins to experience slow, irregular tremors. Rising interest payments, shrinking fiscal room, quiet shifts in global reserve portfolios. Tremors never announce what they are warning. The stages of the pattern reveal themselves one by one, even if no one names them. Military commitments are not framed as overextension. They are framed as duty. Monetary easing is not framed as dilution. It is framed as support. Rising debt is not framed as a spiral. It is framed as manageable. Slowing productivity is not framed as structural decay, it is framed as a temporary lag. Language becomes the anesthetic that allows the cycle to accelerate. In 2025, the United States sits at a point where interest payments exceed the defense budget, a threshold that Spain, Britain, and the Soviets each crossed in their own ways. Not visibly, not with dramatic flair, but in the internal arithmetic that kept tightening until denial could no longer hold it back. A reserve currency is supposed to be the world's anchor. When the anchor begins to drift, the system compensates for a while. Then it adapts. Then it leaves. Adaptation is slower than collapse, but it is just as irreversible. The dollar still commands most global reserves, but shares decline quietly, steadily, almost politely. Not in a rush toward another empire's money, but toward fragmentation, a basket of smaller currencies, a rise in gold. A diversification meant to spread risk rather than express allegiance. This is exactly how the world unwound its dependence on Spanish silver and later on British sterling. Reserve status does not end with a battle, it ends with a shrug. And yet, nothing in America feels like collapse. That is the paradox. Spain felt powerful when the defaults began. Britain felt dignified as it devalued. The USSR held military parades in the final year of its existence. Strength is always most performative when its foundation has begun to shift. No empire perceives its own inflection point. The speed of decline is only obvious once decline has finished. The United States is not Spain in 1590, nor Britain in 1949, nor the Soviet Union in 1991. But it is walking through the same atmospheric pressure, a combination of debt, obligation, trust, and inertia that forms around every reserve currency near its late phase. The structural forces at play are not personal, not political, not emotional. They are mechanical. Once the cycle begins, it does not reverse without a change deeper than policy. The pattern is simple, but the consequences are not. First, the system leans on its privileged currency to solve every problem. Then the currency absorbs more strain than any one instrument should. Then it loses the ability to perform its original function, not by crisis but by overuse. When trust begins to shift, even slightly, the system may still look intact, but its center of gravity has already moved. It never moves back. Spain learned this when silver stopped answering its summons. Britain learned this when sterling was no longer the world's settlement language. The Soviets learned this when their money worked only inside a shrinking circle. What each empire discovered too late was that reserve currencies die long before their nations do. They die in the ledgers first, then in the markets, then in the memories of those who once relied on them without question. And that is where the United States stands in 2025, not on the edge of collapse, but inside a mechanism that has already chosen its direction. The signs do not shout. They whisper. They accumulate. They align with patterns older than any institution now in power. History does not repeat, it explains. And what it explains here is not fate, but structure. The trajectory is not prophecy. It is the inevitable geometry of systems stretched too far for too long. Spain rode its silver until the silver lost meaning. Britain rode its credit until the credit dimmed. The Soviets rode their military until their economy could no longer bear its weight. The United States rides the dollar, and the dollar now carries more than any currency in history has ever been asked to hold.